Okay, thanks everybody for joining us in our breakout session. Feel free to throw any questions in the chat as we're talking, and we can definitely get to them at the end or during. And I'll start by just kicking off a few kind of discussion points about how us at EnergyX have been kind of coping and surviving and thriving with COVID in all aspects of the business. And obviously, I have Nishant here with me, who is the CEO and founder of EnergyX, and then Mike Comiso, who is our all things operations and finance. So I think I'll start by saying that I think initially, at least speaking from my personal experience, but I think many of us share the sentiment that we really kind of underestimated the impact that this was going to have, both at work and in our personal lives. I know early on I was still planning to go visit clients like in the US, and I thought that was going to be totally possible. And then very quickly that changed. So Nishant, I thought it might be interesting for you to kind of paint a picture of that moment that you realized this actually was going to have a big impact on our business, and what were some of your thought processes around that?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe I'll start by just giving everybody a quick overview of EnergyX and who we are. I did have a chance to talk about it very briefly at the I guess the main session where everyone is introducing themselves. But we are very much a tech SaaS based company. We work with utilities across the U.S. and Canada, and we help empower energy efficiency programs. In doing so, we help homes and businesses reduce energy, save money, and become more energy efficient. So to your question, Jesse, the reason I bring up the background is going back to the market, right? We're a SaaS-based platform. We sell to utilities. Utilities are extremely conservative, very long sales cycle. So when the world changed, and I believe it has changed, we're now experiencing the new normal. And it'll be interesting to see what post-COVID brings to us. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball to know, what that looks like. But when the world changed, and I'm going around end of Feb, early March is when we really started feeling the effects in North America in terms of a lockdown, in terms of just a different way of doing business and a different way of conducting ourselves and social distancing. Three things that I looked at least from my macro helicopter view, when I look at EnergyX, when I look at a company, I look at the industry, is what does this mean to our own clients? What does this mean to utilities? And the first thing we noticed right off the bat, and I think this was spread across all different industries, is decisions just stopped, right? Everyone just went in on a holding pattern, and everyone was trying to figure out what was going on and what this meant. What that meant for us is we knew buying cycles were going to be halted for a while. And immediately what that entails for us to do is to look at our own financials, look at our runway, look at cash in the bank, and really understand what this means if we can't forecast new sales anymore. So that's the first thing we noticed. Buying decisions stopping. We already have long sales cycles in our industry, and we didn't really understand at that point what this would do to that. That was the first aspect. The second aspect was much more operational in nature, working remotely, right? We knew now that there's a lockdown. We don't know when we're going to get back to the office. But yet we have an office downtown Toronto, we have an office downtown Halifax, because we've got two offices across Canada. So what does this mean for the rest of the team? And so we had to examine that from an operational perspective and understand what the impacts were for all of our coworkers, and also what the impact was from a productivity perspective. We were fortunate there. We were able to get out of our leases in both Toronto and Halifax, so we didn't have to really worry about the burden of paying expensive rents. But at the same time, because we were a tech company and we were used to working remotely, we knew that we could easily transition to a remote environment. But that means different things for different people, right? If I look at the demographics of everyone in our company, you've got certain individuals who are single, you've got some who have partners, and you've got others who've got a number of kids, right? And that dynamic of working remotely is different for each of those segments. So we really had to understand what that would mean and how we could cater to that. And then the last thing we looked at was, how do we curtail expenses in the sense, how do we get rid of any of the variable costs that we have? And if we could do that and do that in an effective way, it would give us a really good oversight of how we can maintain cash, or keep cash on hand as steady as possible. And that allows us to brace the uncertainty that we were getting into. So from my perspective, it was really looking at those three buckets. What does this mean to our clients? What does this mean from a sales projection standpoint and a buying cycle standpoint? What does this mean from a working productivity standpoint for all of the coworkers within EnergyX? And what does this mean now from a financial expenses maintenance standpoint?
I think on that point, it's a good segue, because early on in the pandemic, EnergyX, our team, I guess, you guys made a bold or at least notable choice, which I'm very grateful for, obviously, and I think Mike is, to keep the entire staff whole and intact. And I think obviously salary is a huge portion of expenses for any startup, or any industry. So how did you come to that decision, and what were the factors that went into kind of choosing to keep that big chunk of the expense pie, despite everything? And thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's interesting you mentioned that, right? And it's really it's a difficult time for any entrepreneur. It's a difficult time for any business, regardless of whether you're at the startup phase or you're on the SME phase, you're a large corporation, right? I mean, the first thing you really want to do is you want to protect your own, and you want to make sure that you can take care of your own. So to me, that comes back to a much more of a philosophical, spiritual discussion in terms of, what do you value as a company? And one thing we've always valued, or we pride ourselves in valuing, is the culture we built in the company. We're a startup. There's a team of 25, across Toronto, across Halifax, and we're close knit, right? So when you start letting people go because of scenarios beyond your control, you're going to start seeing the ripple effects of that in your culture. So the first decision that at least the founders made, along with our board and our investors, really was, how do we keep the team intact? What do we need to do to keep the team intact? And that was the premise we were operating on. Not the premise of, well, okay, if we let a few people go, what does this mean to Runway? No, the premise is we're going to keep the team intact. Now, looking at that, what do we need to do to make sure that we can do that? So the decision was made, we're going to keep the team whole. And then you start looking at, all right, so what does this entail? And I categorize it again in three different phases. The first phase is survival phase. You're at war. You want to make sure that your unit is taken care of, is protected, is effective, and trust and stays together. So what do you need to look at to make sure we do that? The first thing we looked at was we went through all of our financials, and we went through all of the variable costs that we had, and we cut down anything that we could. We knew there was going to be no travel, right? We've got an extensive team that's traveling all the time. We knew none of that was going to happen, so we could save costs there. We knew marketing was really going to come to a standstill. We knew we could get out the rents, which was again a big expense for us, and we were able to strategically get out of that in a very diplomatic way, and that worked in our favor as well. So once you get rid of all those variable costs, then you start looking at, all right, now what's the basic runway look like? And we had an idea of that, and so getting rid of the variable costs, keeping that runway in mind, and understanding what the minimum runway we needed to achieve the team whole, we were able to get done. So that's your first phase. The second phase then is what I call is dealing with the new normal. And that's now now that you've protected the team, how do you protect revenues, and how do you protect your financials? Because we're a SaaS-based platform, a lot of our revenues are reoccurring. So the first thing we wanted to do, and we did, was we ensured that all the reoccurring monthly revenue that we were getting from our existing clients, we continued to get. Again, I think we're lucky in the sense that we are in a utility. We work with utilities. They are very conservative. They are recession-proof, and we're in the energy efficiency space. And we knew energy efficiency programs would continue because climate change is still a very is a global problem that we're solving. So we could take solace in the fact that we may not be able to get new clients in, but we could at least protect our existing clients. So you ensure that your existing revenue continues. You sign up you renew all existing contracts as quickly as you can. So you've got some longevity in your revenue forecast, and you know that you can keep that runway whole for as long as you can. And then we started looking at what was going on from a subsidy grant, non-dilutive funding perspective. And we were able to tap into some of that as well. And I'm sure Mike will go into details on a lot of the government grants and subsidies we were able to tap into. So given that we continued getting revenue in from our existing clients, which is a very solid base of clients, given the problem we're solving, given that we were able to re-sign all existing clients to longer-term contracts, which continued on, and given that we were able to work closely with the government and take advantage or leverage the subsidies that were provided to tech companies like us, that gave us the confidence that we could now continue to at least operate in the new normal. And then comes the last phase, which is what we're slowly getting into now, is how do you continue your growth, right? As a startup, we've been growing 100% year after year after year, and we sacrifice profitability to do that. So how do you continue that growth? And again, I think, there's an element of luck, there's an element of just being in the right industry, having a solution that is scalable, having the right team, having a problem that is universal and global in nature. We looked at seeing whether we could close a round, and we had started the process just before COVID. And on Friday, we just closed a non-dilutive $1 million round with BDC Capital, right? So that gets us to, I think, close to $5 million raised since we started EnergyX. And this round will slowly help us get back into that growth scalability mode. And that's really the third phase. And now it really depends on what post-COVID brings to the table. And as we moved and transitioned from the survival phase to the new normal phase and slowly to the growth phase, we stumbled across something that was unexpected. We actually closed a really big deal in New England, and we did that completely virtually. That was the first deal we've closed in the last 4 or 5 years in EnergyX's history, where we did not have a single face-to-face meeting with the utility. And these are large, complex deals. We have a lot of multi-threading. You have a lot of face-to-face contact. But we were able to do that, which again goes to show how the industry that we are working with and catering to has also evolved in their buying and decision-making process. And so that gave us the confidence that, hold on, not only can we protect existing business and re-sign existing customers, but there is an opportunity here for to slowly bring on new customers and new deals. And it's with that premise now that we start looking at what the next 6 months or the next year will bring to us.
Yeah, Mike, I think, Nishant kind of touched on the philosophical reasons or steps that you go through to kind of keep the team and manage the expenses, but maybe you can speak a little bit to how we actually were able to have the liquidity and the support to be able to do that and make some of those choices that he was speaking about.
Yeah, no, for sure, Jesse. So I think Nishant covered it really well at a high level. Just digging into it at a bit of a more tactical level. So once we decided to keep the team whole, we just really became hyper-focused on preserving capital and extending runway. And so how do we do this? This meant going through non-payroll related expenses just with a really fine-tooth comb, and just making sure we cut out all the fat that wasn't really a part of core operations and core product development. So we made sure, obviously, with the natural ramp down in travel and entertainment expenses, that was off the table. So we got that down pretty close to nil. So that was good, obviously, from a runway perspective. Other than that, we had certain business and development and marketing expenses that we were able to cut down on significantly. And then, as Nishant mentioned as well, we're lucky and fortunate in that we were part of a co-working space prior to COVID-19, and we were on a month-to-month rental agreement with them. So we were able to terminate that as soon as we saw that no one would really be going to the office, no one would be using the office. So it was great to have that flexibility around the contract, and that's why we were a big proponent of having a co-working space prior to COVID-19 versus having more of a longer-term 5 to 10 year big office space agreement and rental, just for that flexibility for these situations. And so then that was the first part, just going through all the expenses and combing out the unnecessary fat. I think secondly, what we did was we created a government support and liquidity task force. And really what this meant, the activities of this task force, was just to stay up to date on all the government support and grant announcements. And so that included, we took advantage of the 10% wage subsidy. We took advantage of the $40,000 in the SEBA loan. So that's interest-free for 2 years until it becomes interest payable, which is very helpful from the Canadian government. We reached out to individuals and organizations, and we had a bit of a PR push around influencing decision makers and other groups which did have control and influence over these government support decisions and whether they continue or not, or how large they would be, and whether companies in the technology sector actually needed this or not. Additionally to that, we kept our sales team focused on their overarching goal, and this goal was obviously to generate revenue. So yes, clients were in a holding pattern, buying cycles were deferred, but at the same time, we tried to do everything we could to make sure we closed the deals that were already in the pipeline. And as Ashan mentioned, we closed a deal in the U.S. with utility, and that was the first one where we haven't really had any on-the-ground interaction with them. It was all face-to-face, and now we're standing up various products with them, which is very exciting. And as Ashan mentioned as well, we really begun to raise the $1 million non-dilutive. This is growth capital before COVID-19. And so the finance team at EnergyX was just really focused and hyper-focused on making sure that we closed that round. You know, it was more paramount than ever and more important than ever that we got that money in. And so we were just completing due diligence process, hyper-focused on making sure that there were no bottlenecks in that process, and so the deal could go through as quickly as possible.
I'm quickly going to switch to some comments that are happening in the chat, because I think it's interesting. So Edward and Stephen are having a conversation about tips for maintaining morale, and I think I can start and you guys can chime in. But I know you guys in the chat are talking about remote team happy hours and trivia and those types of things, and we definitely started implementing several of those same kind of activities, which I think really made a world of a difference in keeping the team connected. And I will say, I think for me at least, one thing that was really valuable was having dedicated team time that isn't for work-related talk, which can be hard, but we've kind of broken out so half of our weekly team meetings are just dedicated to like a fun activity. And I think that's been really nice to just know you have that time where even if work is really busy, you're just going to talk about something else or talk about people's lives. And I think that was really great. And I think we will continue that probably post-COVID.
Yeah, it's a great comment. And so again, thanks for voicing that, Jesse, because I'm always interested, as you know, to hear about what all our coworkers think, right? One of the things we did from a strategic level was we did this at the start of the year, actually. So COVID just happened as it happened. Is what we wanted to do was really wanted to break down silos. We found as we were growing and as different teams were growing, the marketing team was growing, and the sales and the product and the engineering and the development and the data science and customer success and finance. And as you start seeing these teams grow, there's a natural tendency sometimes just to start working in silos. And from a startup perspective, when you want to be when you're focused on being scalable and repeatable and really focused on very high growth, you've got to continually ensure that you're breaking down silos and you start having cross-functional teams very working closely together. And so that was an initiative that we had started right at the start of the year to really make sure we could do that successfully. And then COVID hit. And I liken it to you go from a relationship when you're together to going into a long distance relationship. And one thing in my experience in long distance relationships, I've realized is you've got to over communicate, and that's the only way you can sustain. You can get away with under communicating when you're with someone face to face, because body language and certain non-verbal signs can make such a difference. But when you're in a long distance relationship, all you've got is communication. And it was awesome for us to see how everyone as a team understood that, and we just started over communicating. And if I look at what we're doing now, I mean, we've got monthly lunch and learns where we'll have every division do an hour presentation about what they've been working on for the last month and what they want to work on for the next month, and how does this factor in with the overall strategy of the company and where we want to be. We've got weekly team meetings. We've had town hall meetings on a quarterly basis. I'm very clear in getting everyone to understand what our 3 or 4 strategic objectives are for the year from a strategic perspective. And then we'll have all the different teams talk about how they're meeting that from a tactical perspective. And so I think what COVID has really helped us do is over communicate, and you can never go wrong when you over communicate. But really curious to hear again, Mike, your take on it. How have you seen that come into play prior to COVID and what we're seeing today, at least from an EnergyX perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I could speak having pre-COVID worked in a bit of the product group, just having the operational role at the company, having worked in a bit of the product group, a bit of the sales group, and then obviously heading up the finance team. I just say that pre-COVID, we did have certain meetings where we'd get together and we'd discuss certain issues that would be affecting each different silo. But it wasn't necessarily a deliberate push towards making sure everybody was on the same level and on the same page. And I think that really became magnified post-COVID, even when maybe it should have been a pre-COVID concern of ours. Just post-COVID, it really forced us to say, we really need to take this time out of our schedule to really understand who could help us with a certain problem. We can't just walk over to their desk spontaneously and ask them if they have time to go over something or to perform a certain task. We actually have to set some time in and have these meetings to be able to understand, well, what is on everybody's plate? What does their schedule look like? How much capacity do they have to actually deal with a certain concern that I'm having? And I think setting up these weekly meetings, and especially the lunch and learns, like these lunch and learns that Nishant mentioned, we really dive into the process-oriented nature of what every group does. So if I look at the software engineering group, they go into which projects they're actually working on, which actual language they're using, like what that whole workflow looks like, and that'll give me a better sense of how much I should be allocating maybe in the financials towards budgetary concerns towards the web development team, whether sales could go to the web development team and come in with a request or not, where they have time or capacity to do that on their schedule. I think that just became much more clear post-COVID because it was deliberate on our part to implement this, understanding and breaking down silos across the whole group.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. It's been really helpful to kind of understand the diversity of workload and who might be able to help. I think we're at our time, unfortunately. I know we wanted to dive in a little bit to kind of some of those government funding programs that Mike had mentioned, but I don't think we'll have time to do it today. But I will say that if anybody has questions about navigating the wage subsidy versus the IRAP IAP, that's something that we really worked on a lot during COVID, and we were excited to leverage, and we're happy to connect on LinkedIn to discuss any of that or anyone else's experiences about surviving and thriving during COVID. So thank you all so much for coming. It's 10 p.m. where I am, 9 p.m. in Toronto, so enjoy the rest of your evenings, and thanks to TechTO for hosting.
Yeah, for sure, and thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.